if your family moves from South India to Louisville, Kentucky when you're 12 years old? What is your perceived place in the world around you? How are you seen if you are a non-white, non-Christian resident of the United States the day after the Twin Towers came down, September 11th, 2001? Joining us via Skype, attorney Deepa Iyer is here to talk about post-9/11 America and the challenges affecting diverse communities in the U.S., all detailed in her new book, We Too Sing America. Deepa, it's a pleasure to welcome you to Feel Like You Belong.
Thank you for having me.
So talk just a little bit about, you were 12 years old, your dad has a job at the University of Louisville, and you moved to Kentucky. There was some culture shock. You talked about moments of feeling like you didn't fit in. Can you talk just a little bit about that?
Sure. So I moved to the United States from India when I was 12. And in the mid-1980s, when we moved from Kerala, India to Louisville, Kentucky, definitely experienced a lot of racial confusion, because the way in which race was framed in the South at the time was really through a black or white binary or framework. And so people like myself, who were from Asian countries, immigrating to the United States, really had these episodes of not knowing whether we were white, black, where we fit in, and the like. So I think it's not uncommon for many immigrant communities to have those experiences of confusion, trying to figure out both how do we embrace our cultural linguistic identities and at the same time feel that we are part of the American fabric.
So at what age did you come to some understanding of your fit in the mix?
I think that it's something that I have been negotiating for quite some time. And I think as I went to college and was able to get more involved with different types of associations and connect with other students of color, other students who were like myself, Indian Americans, and then went on to law school, my sense of understanding of my identity evolved. I understood that it wasn't just about a cultural identity, that it was also about a political identity and a racial identity. And that definitely came more to a head, as you alluded to in the introduction, in the days and weeks after the September 11th attacks.
So it was 14 years, I think, between the attacks and the publication. By the way, congratulations on your new book, published just this last fall, 2015, We Too Sing America. What was the motivation?
Right. So for me, what happened in the weeks and months after 9/11, I was a civil rights attorney working at the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. at the time, and experienced, as I write in the book, a double grieving. Grieving, of course, for the horrendous losses that our country had suffered on that day, and not really comprehending why. And then grieving also for people in my own community, South Asian, Sikh, Muslim, Arab, anyone perceived to be from those communities, who really felt that they were being scrutinized a little bit more than they used to be. We started hearing reports of hate violence affecting our communities, people being taken off of airlines, people being bullied in schools, children who wore turban or hijab, for example. And so as those reports came in, I think people like myself experienced an additional sense of grief as to what was happening in America. And so I wrote the book because I wanted to really share and impart many of the lived experiences of what it means to live in post-9/11 America. And so the stories that are in the book, the policy recommendations, many of them are drawn from my experiences directing a nonprofit called South Asian Americans Leading Together, which I did for about 10 years after, in the wake of 9/11. And so I wanted to make sure that we had a more complete understanding, a more complete history of what it means to be Muslim, Sikh, South Asian, or Arab in the United States right now.
Sure, sure. So there are a number of themes in the book. Can you flesh those out for us?
Sure. So I argue in the book that in the 15 years since 9/11, what we have seen is sort of the three forces coming together. So the first is Islamophobia, which is this perception that anyone who is Muslim or could be Muslim is a terrorist. The second is racial anxiety, which is this feeling that our country's demographics are changing very rapidly, and some people are anxious about that. They're anxious that they might lose their own benefits and privileges because there are more communities moving into their neighborhoods, for example. And the third is anti-immigrant sentiment. So, for example, what we've been seeing lately in the country in terms of pushing back against Syrian refugees, or having people say, well, you know, we need to have really strong borders between the United States and other countries. So those three forces, anti-immigrant sentiment, as well as Islamophobia and racial anxiety, have really been percolating in our country over the last 15 years. And in my book, I posit that it is the communities I write about that have been on the front lines, that have received the brunt of these three forces coming together. And my book also asks, well, what can we do about it, right? As we look into the future, as we look into a time where our country will become a country where people of color will be the majority by 2042, what is it that we can all do in order to create safer, more inclusive, and multiracial communities around the country?
You talk of a very dramatic story talking about being on the front line from Oak Creek, Wisconsin. Can you tell that?
Sure. So the story of Oak Creek, Wisconsin, that many of your viewers and listeners might know about, is of a place of worship that belongs to the Sikh community, the Sikh American community in the U.S., which is a community that has been in this country for over 100 years. Many of the Sikhs in America wear turbans. They keep their hair, so they have long beards. And so there is a gurdwara, or a temple, that was constructed by the Sikh community in Oak Creek, which is outside on the outskirts of Milwaukee. And on August 5th, 2012, that community suffered a horrendous blow. A man who we later learned was affiliated with several white supremacist groups came in and shot and killed 6 people, injured others, and terrorized that entire community on a Sunday morning when people were coming to gather for worship. And that massacre is important to remember for several reasons. First is that it happened in 2012. And when you think about the post 9/11 backlash, many people assume that the hate violence was limited in scope to perhaps the first few years after 9/11. But we can actually see that 10 years onwards, we're still seeing a massacre like this occur, which indicates again that living in post 9/11 America is a daily phenomenon for our communities. But the second important part about recounting that story is to really show the strength of the community, the resilience of that community. It wasn't just the Sikh American families and community that came together in the aftermath. It was the Mayor Steve Scafidi. It was law enforcement. In fact, Lieutenant Brian Murphy is the police officer who stopped the white supremacists from hurting other people. And so I tried to recount the stories of the children, the activists, the government agencies, the law enforcement who came together in response to this act of hate violence, but also to ask ourselves, how can we prevent this from happening again in another community?
Do you think that more immigrant communities, for example, like the Sikhs, are doing a more proactive outreach in their communities just to educate their surrounding non-immigrant citizens?
Well, I think it has to be an approach that is both ways. It can't just be one way. I think that it's really important that as immigrants share their cultures, that they talk about their backgrounds, their stories, and their histories, that it is also important and incumbent upon, welcoming communities or receiving communities to do the same. And so what I've been seeing around the country, especially on my book tour, is, for example, I was speaking at a church, a Methodist church recently in Virginia, and they were interested perhaps in opening up their own church to refugee families, right? And so the importance of actually lending an open hand, of opening our doors to newcomers. And it's something that I think we need to really rely upon right now as our country changes, but also as the political rhetoric in our country becomes more and more vitriolic and divisive. It's very important that we really lean into our values of inclusion, of respecting diversity, of really understanding that America is stronger when we have a plethora of people from all backgrounds contributing to what it is to be American.
Sure. The story in Oak Creek was obviously a very, very traumatic, very, very widely spread news story. There are lots of smaller stories, and you talked about a young boy in Texas.
Right. So that is another example of something that's actually been in the news recently. I think the story of Ahmad Mohammed, who is a young a Black Muslim teenager who brought in a homemade clock to his high school, and it was immediately perceived to be a bomb by school administrators. And again, that is a reflection of the implicit biases that many of us hold, right, towards each other, where we perceive someone to be a threat when we don't even know anything about them and we haven't asked the questions to understand who they are and what they're doing. And so some questions might have revealed that this young boy had just been participating in a science experiment. So when we challenge our own internal biases by disrupting our thoughts and asking ourselves, well, why am I getting scared that there is a woman wearing a hijab sitting next to me on a plane? Let me actually interrogate myself and understand why that's happening, right? So the way in which we develop our biases are very much influenced by what we see in the media, what we hear in terms of media narratives of Muslim and those perceived to be Muslims. So it's very important that we approach Islamophobia or any type of racism on multiple levels, both individually. How can we interact with each other with more openness, dialogue, as well as understanding structurally how it comes out, right? So whether it's the media or government policies, how can we shift those so that they're not perpetuating misleading narratives about each other?
So for the individual, it's how can I begin to see people who I have labeled as the other. When they walk into my building with a science project, we can also say, oh, that's a brown or black kid with a science project, and not, terrorists and ne'er-do-well. So.
Right. I think each of us has a role to play. And of course, we need to challenge our government institutions, our elected leaders, and other sorts of entities to also live up to some of the values that we share in terms of openness and diversity.
Sure. We have to wrap up in a moment, but I wanted to ask you two quick last questions. You work for the Center for Social Inclusion. In a nutshell, what is the mission of that organization?
So CSI is an organization that really strives to address racial inequity in a structural way. So we provide trainings, resources, and tools to organizations and individuals, government agencies around the country to actually identify how we can get rid of, how we can eliminate the inequities that exist between people of color and non-people of color in this country in a variety of situations. And I also wanted to let folks know that I'm actually going to be in Grand Rapids. I'm very excited about that. I will be there on June 13th, speaking at an event that is being organized by the Progressive Women's Alliance. And the event is happening at Lose More Auditorium at the GVSU. I'm not sure what that stands for. You probably know.
Grand Valley State University.
There you go. So that's June 13th. And if you go on the website of the Progressive Women's Alliance, you can purchase tickets. And I would love to meet with as many community residents as possible.
Well, we wanted to give a shout out to that event because it is a fundraiser for the Progressive Women's Alliance. We'll certainly put that website on the screen and get this news out to our viewers as soon as we can, because it's an important message, and I know that you're going to inspire a lot of people with your presence. And I definitely plan on stopping by to shake your hands in person as opposed to this little video hello that we're doing right now.
Oh, I look forward to that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
The Soviet domination of Latvia was really crushing. What made it so that finally people had to leave in the 40s and 50s?
Well, during the Second World War II, there were, I would say, almost 3 occupations. One was from Soviets, then Germans came in, and then again Soviets. And every time, of course, it was mandatory to really bow to whichever regime it was. And